Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. I know that there are a lot of people that will be watching this later due to various time zones, but I want to welcome everybody. This is our Synaptec Spotlight Series, where every month we have different speakers talking about a variety of topics on science, research, and how Synaptec plays a part in their lives. Sessions typically run for about an hour with approximately 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. You can use the Q&A chat there. I'll be monitoring that, so feel free to post questions even as we go through talking with our guests. So as things come up, feel free to drop those in there and I will get to them when appropriate. We have a lot of people all over the world that are either watching this or will watch this. So, make sure that you sign up for these, but also make sure that you follow us on, especially LinkedIn and Instagram. We're always having interesting topics that we discuss, so make sure to follow us so that you don't miss anything. And without further ado, I want to introduce everybody to Dr. Kelly Starrett. Hi, Kelly.
Good morning.
So, Kelly is the co founder and chief officer of the Ready State. So, those of you that may not know, Kelly is a physical therapist, but also expert and CrossFit trainer, author, New York Times bestseller, and movement expert. Is known for really revolutionizing the understanding of human mobility and performance. He co-founded San Francisco's CrossFit and the Ready State. And like I said, he's a New York Times bestseller. Some of you have probably read Becoming a Supple Leopard or Ready to Run or Built to Move. He also works with elite athletes, military corporations, and the overall public to help improve movement, to prevent injuries and enhance performance and really quality of life. And Kelly, you have a really interesting background. So before we get to the main topic, I'm curious if you can give us some insight of what led up to creating the Ready State. What was the motivation then and now?
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be on this call with so many fabulous coaches. And I love anytime we get coaches and providers together. It just ends up creating a sort of spontaneous cabal where, this coterie of big brains is sometimes lacking in the fact that many of us are just so autonomous and we're working so hard to solve the problems in front of us that we can't avail ourselves of the amazing brains in the room. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Tiff. First and foremost, I think it's easy to forget that 20 years ago when we really started this thing, the world was really geared. We're going to call it sort of the end of first wave adaptation, fitness, strength conditioning, really the first wave of performance. We're seeing the adoption of early, this is early 2000s. We're seeing like finally people are using heart monitors. There's more than one kind of fueling besides a power bar, molten nut power bar. And, fast forward a little bit, and what we end up seeing is suddenly the internet has this sort of done a really good job of introducing modern strength and conditioning beyond those of us who grew up in professional sports, those of us who, maybe came out of an Olympic track and field experience or were part of a university strength and conditioning model. The rest of the world was sort of left to its own devices, which was traditionally kind of bodybuilding centric ideas. And what we've seen now is as that started to proliferate, suddenly we could ask this question through just the launching of social media, of YouTube, is decentralizing some of these knowledge bases. And one of the things that we worked really hard on is recognizing that we felt like the place where people should be able to identify position restriction or movement limitations or understand their technique as a diagnostic tool was in the center of training. And that gave us an opportunity to put coaches and athletes in control of sort of understanding hotspots, putting out and managing sort of the problems of being a competitive person, and putting those squarely into the context of the gym. What we saw was The model used to be, let's just train really hard, while train the competition until we break, and then we'll go and engage in this medical model, which really doesn't have the context, the nuance, isn't talking about sleep, nutrition, performance, recovery, volume, looking at movement quality. It really is, we're like, you would take this complex person who has real experience in the world, and then you would take them into this room where they, with a hung, ceiling and a carpeted floor. And that person didn't watch you run. They didn't watch you lift. They didn't know anything about your competition, your mindset, your nutrition, any of your training experience. And theoretically, we were supposed to solve those problems. And what we tried to do is say, hey, we can be working on position. We can have these movement assessments built into the strength and conditioning language, which is the formal movement language of humans. It's not the only movement language, of course, but it's a really easy way to say it makes the invisible visible. The diagnostic tool is also the stimulus for adaptation, which meant that if you're training and squatting, we can really understand, or lunging, why potentially you can't access this position, or you're making these movement choices later on. So what we started doing, because we owned a gym for 20 years in the city, and in that gym, we saw professional teams and athletes and Olympians and MMA fighters and everyone that you could possibly shake a stick at. We got better and better at saying, hey, we need to empower coaches and people to be able to take a crack first at fixing themselves and in restoring and improving their positions. When we wrote Supple Leopard, 2013 now, I mean, it's been a hot minute. We only have two objective measures there. And this is really important because, there's a lot of feelings out there about, I have the best secret squirrel program. But ultimately, the two metrics that we could hang our hats on were, range of motion. Does someone have normative range? And that was really clinically defined by, what all the therapists, all the chiros, all the physician groups, everyone said, hey, the shoulder should do this. The hip should have relatively this much motion. We should be able to turn our heads this far. And what we saw was that language did not exist as part of the strength and conditioning experience. It was just, well, yeah. We'll just, goose the available physiology. Strength coaches were doing the things that they could do in the time they could. And then coaches were about, in the business of, hey, we have to practice and train. And no one really owned this shape and position. So we really started to say, hey, let's come back to these normative ranges. And then the second thing was that we said, hey, these positions transfer more effectively. And we know that because we can measure wattage and poundage and output. And those two things, that biomotor output plus range of motion, those things together really is where we hung our hats and said, hey, how does the physiology match up with these pieces? Then the next step, of course, is how do we help coaches and providers and users begin to think, where do we put all this stuff, right? I mean, so I have 24 hours. I still got to train. I still got to do all the things. Maybe I'm managing a sport problem or an injury or return to play. Where and how are we going to goose these ranges of motion as it changes over season, sport age, hormone profile, et cetera, et cetera. So ultimately, that led us into more and more conversations where we're invited into Premier Soccer and Premier Rugby, and just choose a sport, and then everyone's like, here's our dirty laundry, help us solve these problems. And that honestly leads you naturally to a certain set of conclusions, like the brain is really important here,
Mhm.
vision is really important here. And ultimately, everyone, I found Senaptec because I saw this technology and was like, this is such an easy layup for me to integrate this into the things I'm doing. And I bought my own goggles. I bought several pairs, and one for my own kids because it was just fun to play with. And two, I started integrating it immediately into the sports I was using, saying, hey, I think this is useful. And it just became such a no-brainer. And that's how I got here, is that I saw that, hey, if we could goose and upregulate vision and upregulate understanding and perception, we saw we had better outcomes. Then add in the fact that, I'm a busy working coach. So amongst the other things I do, I'm a volunteer physical therapist at University of California, Berkeley. So I get access to, I have 800 athletes every year, right? I help, solve problems with Olympians and superstars. And I come in and sort of tear apart and, give outside counsel. But I travel and I'm the performance lead for the women's water polo team. And what that means is I can see quickly what perfect squirrel program, how that falls apart when I'm dealing with 25 superstars who have college, who have personalities and don't want to be living like monk, athletes. How and where do we put these things in? And that leads us to thinking of differently about what is our movement preparation look like? How do we integrate all of the tools and all the tactics that we know allow us to have elite performance? And that's where ultimately the subject of this conversation that we're going to have today. How do we integrate vision training and sort of eye movement into the warm-ups and integration so that we can play for another national championship?
That's right, and you touched on a subject that is very dear to my heart, because for decades you've been helping people move better, and looking at where are the biggest areas of opportunity to improve, and you've spent a lot of time looking at, I would say, the training ecosystem, if you will,
Mm,
um, and and oftentimes, what I have found is either missed or disregarded, and is what we're going to be touching on next, is specifically the warm up. And I can say from personal experience as a former professional runner, the easiest part to skip of the training ecosystem is the warm up. And even though we know we should, we don't always, or we have excuses as to why we don't do it, or we rush through.
yeah.
So there's this false perception of priorities that influence our decision making, which then lead us often to either skipping a warm up or just rushing through so that we can, yep, check the box, coach. Yep, I warmed up. I'm
Oh,
ready to go.
and when you're 17, I mean, you really hit it on the head. When you're 17, you're like, "What are we doing?" Like, I can touch my toes, I can do the splits, like, "Let's go," and, like, this feels like a
That's
waste of
right.
time. And I think you bring something up that's really important is that even the language of warm up is really unidimensional. Like, can I go in a sauna and just sit in the hot tub? Now I'm warm. So, ultimately, what we want people to understand, especially in these first 15 minutes, is that let's use or however long you have, let's use a different set of languages. Warm up is not what we do. We're into movement preparation or session preparation. And fundamentally, we can, sort of think critically about, what are the intentions of this? Well, the intention is that I can have a better practice with athletes who are more trained to each other, more attuned to each other, who have, theoretically, as a coach who's paying attention, I can use this movement preparation time, aka warm up, as a place to layer in skill development and some exposure to positions and shapes that maybe we can't touch as well or we feel like is deficient. One of my favorite coaches is a guy named Rhett Larson. And if everyone hasn't followed Rhett Larson, you should absolutely. And he's Rhettasaurus on Instagram. He was former sort of lead programmer at Exos, and now he's the strength conditioning and performance coach for German national volleyball team. He's also won a gold medal with China. He's very effective, but his concept of no zombies is a warm up. He's like, I just saw people kind of loafing through coaches, you're like, okay, run around the thing. I'll see you back here. And it
Yeah.
really isn't inspiring. It's not fun. And we lose a lot of potentiation, opportunity. And what I'll say is, if we layer in another kind of filter on top of that, the brain is not wired for performance. The brain is wired for safety. And so, one of the things that we can be doing in this movement preparation by getting ourselves connected to our teammates, by raising core temperature, by taking, being in positions and shapes that we may not be able to get into by playing, is that we can signal safety, that it's okay to take the break off and go ham. And one of the filters, again, layering again, is that we start asking this question: if we treated a sporting event or a training session like a fight, you and I, Tiffany, are going to get into a fight. What does your fight preparation look like? We're going to step into the ring in 20 minutes and we're going to fight each other. And if you're on the bike and then laying down on the ground rolling, I'm going to kill you. I mean, like I'm like, I don't even, this is amazing, and so one of the things that I think has been useful is saying, hey, if I had to take this group of people and then actually put them in the ring and engage in mortal combat, what would the choices look like if I
Mm,
had those choices? And suddenly we see that, boy, I need to be quick. I haven't moved fast. I haven't had a chance to connect and be a train to my other teammates. I've been on my computer all day long. Where am I going to
mm,
turn and put all this tracking, this vision? Where do I get, touch, play and react? And what we found is, this is not subjective, that when we track changes in our movement preparation, we see commensurate changes in our performance. So I'll give you an example. At Cal Women's Water Polo, our first quarter is the best quarter in the nation, and that's because our movement preparation is so much better, that the second quarter we start to normalize because the other team is finally warmed up. But if we've hung 6 points on you in the first quarter because you aren't as primed and ready to go, then you're always going to be playing this deficit game with us. So that's where we started to look at, where are we talking about breath and CO2 desensitization? Where are we getting our brains involved and our reactions involved? And suddenly we start to put the right pieces there. And what we have is a group of people who are ready to go and do a task that is of speed and consequence, and they're much better prepared. In the bargain, we get things like fewer soft tissue strains. We
mm,
get better, more complete access to positions where the brain says that's safe. We can solve this problem, right? We have a lot more play and enjoyment. And suddenly, because it can be so varied, it's a really wonderful place to do some deep coaching for the first 20 minutes. So we get our athletes moving, but now we can really coach, we can touch shapes, we can sort of integrate. And for coaches out there, if you're listening, this is one of the places where we can grab things that we've seen on the internet and play. Like, oh, I saw this game, I saw this drill, I saw this tag, I saw this. And it really does create this creative environment where you get to come in, instead of saying, oh, we're going to swim this, or we're going to do these drills that we've always done. What do these athletes need in front of me? How do I take these first 20 minutes and make it much more effective? Anson Dorrance, who is a really famous soccer coach for the women at UNC Chapel Hill. Um, they have UNC Chapel Hill has produced more national champions in women's sports than any other university. And one of the things that is useful is, again, looking at what are the best coaches and best practices here. And one of the things that we saw with Anson, that he talked about in his documentary, is that, or in his book, was that he was having his women run this 800 kind of speed walk, run 800. And he was like, this is a terrible use of time, because we're not doing drills, we're not doing the things we want. But what he saw in that time was that when he pulled it out, his athletes performed worse. So there's two lessons here. Number one, the first lesson is, how would we measure and track, that what we're doing is making us better at the thing? How do we get faster into a more dense training session, a more dense experience? What are the objective measures here? And in this situation, he saw that when he removed this 800-meter kind of run, his players performed more poorly. But what really was happening there was that it gave the athletes a time to transition from, being students, reconnecting with their team, and transitioning into this high network. And that is the lesson I want to take away here. We don't have to go run an 800 and hope it happens. As soon as we are playing and catching and playing tug of war and throwing and battling and pushing on each other and laughing, we can have the same thing. And that first, 800 meters, or, which is this idea that if I have this amount of time, how do I get this group of people to be shift gears and to be with each other? And that's
mhm.
as important as any other thing.
Yeah, and you mentioned briefly about being on a screen. Now, I've gone to a lot of different sports teams over the last couple of years, and I've watched while they look at their phones and on their screens right before a game even, and definitely before a practice. And so there's some issues obviously with that, like going from just a screen and then thinking you're going to just snap and turn it on and go play well in a game. But if somebody's thinking, well, what's the first step? You talk about breathing. So if I'm like, okay, I'm a coach, I'm gonna say, team, put away the electronics. As a runner, am very keen on first getting my breathing right. And I'm curious, what have you found with the breath work? Because I'm big on really expanding the diaphragm. Like, do I feel my back expanding?
Yeah.
Really, really making sure I go beyond just a shallow breath to where I'm really engaging my core and my pelvic floor. And so I'm curious if there's any tips and tricks that you have, when we look at 15 minutes, let's just say, like, is there a good progression that you've seen, maybe a little bit more prescriptive or protocol-ish that you can give some insight to that
Yeah,
you've seen
and
work?
I love that you're thinking in that term. You know, we have, I think, a model that is from Fredericks, who is an architect. It's this idea of informed simplicity. When we begin, we have a few sort of key representation things: nutrition, strength, right? Maybe sport, right? There's something other over here. You sort of, as a coach, have a few things that start to happen. You're like, these are essentials. And then as you begin to practice, you're like, okay, well, this CO2 desensitization model of getting the diaphragm prepped, that's important. So I just bolt that on. And then,
Mhm.
suddenly I'm like, oh, I got to do some eye training. I bolt that on. And then, what you're realizing is that pretty soon you have this really sort of complexity through aggregation that really is difficult to understand inputs and outputs. And in software design, that's called a kludge, where you have an original piece of software and then you keep bolting things on, and pretty soon it's not very sexy. It
Yeah.
doesn't work very well, and the whole thing just, you can't see. And what ends up happening for a lot of busy coaches is that someone comes in and says, hey, this is really important, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, this is really important. So we do it for a while, that pretty soon it pushes something else out that was essential, and then it just becomes like a dusty thing in the corner that maybe we touch, or like, oh yeah, we used to do that. So to your point, I'll give you an example of my own experience. When I have time, when we're traveling before matches, for example, um, I usually am able to take 10 or 15 minutes and do some breath practice early before we actually engage in our movement preparation. So as a standalone, sometimes it's before breakfast. And what we really are doing is, you can get deep into the complex physiology of the breath work, but I'm just like, hey, mechanically, your back is stiff and your diaphragm isn't primed, and I
Mhm.
want to get it so that your brain has become desensitized to CO2 again, right? Like that's one of the
Yes.
things that happens. And miraculously, we see athletes who had anxiety or disorders get better as they become a little bit more CO2 tolerant and less sensitized to rising CO2s. We do see the changes. The question is, when I don't have that time as a standalone 10 minutes, because our women understand what's going on there, they appreciate it, and it improves things like VO2 max, right? We're not looking at how well the container moves when we're trying to perform. Then immediately we will do breath constrained activities. And I'll give you a few examples. Number one is that I love a jump rope, immediately getting people moving, because I have kids transitioning, and just the jumping is going to upregulate everything. We're immediately bouncing, we're immediately going, and all of a sudden I'll just put a breath hold in there. So we can do an inhale breath hold, an exhale breath hold. And as soon as I put you in exhale breath hold and I make you compete against someone to see who can get the most skips on an exhale breath hold, what's going to happen is I put kids deep into, hypoxic, trauma, hypoxic event. And then simultaneously, they've got to recover nose only. So I can constrain this kind of breathing quality just by making us do something. Another example is that I love to do resisted runs. It's a really good way for us to be explosive and powerful. And the person who's, working as the brake person, she has to do all this deceleration, right? So I get all this deceleration work. We're priming the quads, all those things. It's fun. We race. But then I'm like, okay, now you got to do it on an exhale. And so we'll race on this exhale. Or a third example is I'll have athletes, we love contact because this water polo sport is a contact sport. And I'll have our athletes, wrestle a little bit, push on each other, wrestle, tag, and we'll do it on a breath hold. And so suddenly all I've done is said, hey, here's something that I know makes for a better game. Here's something that I know that prepares our athletes for contact, right? For listening, for interacting, for getting sweaty and hot and all the things we do. And then I just layered in a breath control piece on top of that. And in what we start to see is, boy, that's real dense. It's real fun. And it gives me as a coach a lot of opportunities besides, hey, I'm going to do this balloon drill. The kids at Postural Restoration Institute are amazing, right? You've read James Nestor's book. You're a Patrick McEwen, Oxygen Advantage fan. Where do I put this stuff into a busy session? And what we have to do then is be thinking, I need to get prepared so that when I do have that first hypoxic experience in practice in the match, my brain doesn't freak out and automatically protect me. It says, hey, we've actually been here many times. I always shoot for 7 hypoxic events. That's not clinically relevant, but that when I have had 7 exposures across a bunch of games on breath holds, breath work, long exhale, breath, whatever it is, 7 turns out to be a magic number for me where I feel like I've had enough. So if I get 6, that's great. If I get 8, but 7 is I'm looking for 7 deaths before we go.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'm very familiar, for example, with PRI and balloon work. I've done it and it's
It's
great, but
awesome. It's just where do we put it?
exactly, exactly. And
And
and I
and
I
and let me just sorry to
yeah.
interrupt. If you have a breathing disorder, then that's a standalone session. And that's where what we have to do a good job of is be creative enough to say, there's real merit and real value in this skill. Can I take
Mhm.
elements of it and apply it to a performance lens? And that is really where we start to see that we are infinite in our abilities to improve performance and have people feel like, wow, I can do anything. And now we actually see who's the best coach and who has the best genetics.
Yeah. All those other factors.
That's right. That's right.
Right, right. And so now, there's a lot of to unpack here, but let's now think about like what you have done, like with the strobes, for example, and really preparing the body, the nervous system. There's a lot that goes into this. So what are just some more specific examples about vision training, cognitive challenges that coaches
Yeah.
could bring in to this, and dare I say, warm up? But as the common term as of now, I'll call it a warm up. But movement preparation, which I think that you should coin that phrase, and we should all start using it. But what are some insights that you could give maybe a little bit more specifically, especially like with the strobes? Because we get a lot of questions about,
Yeah.
I have these strobes, what should I do?
That's right. That's right. So one of the things that let's do is the strobes highlight for us that we're making a lot of informed decision making about visual data, right? That's what. And this, as everyone knows here, when we occlude that, then I have to start making inferences about what's going on, and that does speed up pattern recognition. That does speed up my ability to have incomplete information and to react and make better decisions. Um, so my issue with the strobes, and sorry everyone, is that sometimes I don't have 30 pairs of strobes. That's my dream, is that I have 30 pairs of strobes, but I work in a non-revenue women's sport. And sometimes when I'm in basketball, I'm like, okay, it's a lot easier. But in this situation, what I can do is say is, hey, there's real utility. And so in our positions that we know are going to have to make a lot more information
Mm,
choices, like AKA our goalies, we have strobes for all goalies, and goalies all have their own strobes. And that allows us now for our goalies to do their normal drills and then add in this simple layer on top of the things they're already doing. So the place to begin for all of us of integration is, hey, if I'm already beginning a movement preparation or a game preparation skill piece, then all I'm just going to do is layer this in and add a degree of difficulty, the same way we would maybe add a weight belt, or constrain the environment a little bit. And what we see is it just takes the dials and it turns it up. So our athletes suddenly are, the brain is working a lot more effectively at being able to be at its available processing limit. And the strobes not only are a training tool, but they're a tool that allows us to just turn the volume back up to where we know is possible. And, simple examples is that, we're just doing, tennis ball drills with our athletes, especially our goalies, and having them block and react at an appropriate level is a way where we can get so much more out of the drill. So now what we say is, okay, these strobes meaningfully change the outputs of the athletes that are using them in terms of decision making and visual processing. How can I do the same thing if I don't have strobes? Well, I have eyelids, and I also can have my athletes be blinded and have to react. So if I toss a ball over an athlete's head, she's got to pick that up. Or if I have the athlete bounce and turn around. One of the games we play, that I really love because it gets everyone hot and sweaty, it's super fun, is we play hacky sack, but with our hands. And so it's just we get groups of 4 athletes, we play hacky sack. Any touch is valid. And the idea is we say, make it weird. So instead of just being here, can we get low? Can we come across the body? And then I'll say, hey, you've got to touch the ball. And then after you touch the ball, you have to perform a spin. So we basically occlude vision. We have to ask the athlete to engage in a complex motor task where they now got to pick the ball back up out of space. And that is, we'll call it a strobe analog. So what I'm really looking for is, how do I get strobe analog effects where I have an athlete, maybe one of my favorite drills is I'll have 2 athletes battling each other in the middle, and they have 2 other athletes on the side throwing a ball back and forth. So they're playing catch, but they've got to have some awareness with the athlete they're engaged with in contact and battle, and simultaneously turning back around to pick up the ball. And so suddenly what you see is, hey, I'm turning the neck, I'm turning the eyes, and I've got to make these decisions off of incomplete information versus you and I are looking at each other, throwing the ball at each other. And the strobes will give you, if you're paying attention, give you insight into, how do I replicate a strobe like effect? What is a strobe analog, or a strobe conjugate, for a lack of a better word? And what we start to see is, okay, now, hey, we're doing some rope flow, we're spinning the ropes, we're getting primed, and I'm making the athlete track the rope with her eyes and pick up the rope again as it comes over. So she's got to take her head, eyes into a whole bunch of different corners and visual fields. And she's got to do that tracking over and over and over again. And once again, if I have strobes, I'll use them. But here's how I'm integrating, thinking about all of this vision. So where are we making our athletes have to see depth perception changes, reaction changes, vision changes, and that's where this idea of the strobes I've been able to integrate into so many other things that we're doing. And our athletes end up being much quicker, much faster. And their brains are like, whoa, what's this? It turns out to be Miracle-Gro in athletes who are asleep.
Nice. Nice. And yeah, so you're really priming the senses, but what I keep hearing is you're also making it really fun. And I think
Amen.
that's so critical, to have this excitement, if you will. We know that it can have an effect on neuroplasticity. So I think that adding this in, I feel like sometimes people think, oh, it has to be prescriptive, it has to be
Mm.
protocol, and we wanna see people be more creative. Yes, there are reasons and best practices as those that you just shared, but also making it fun is critical.
Yeah, and I appreciate you really saying that, because it is easy suddenly to recognize or bring in this complexity. So, you know, we can see vision training after a concussion, after like when we pick up a convergence problem, and we do have protocols that we might follow in the same way we would follow a protocol for any injury or any deficit or any sort of, impairment. And that is different than sort of flipping the switch and saying, how do I engage anytime, even in those things? And I will tell you that Senaptec does a good job of gamifying a lot, right? Because we know that people like to play, learning happens better in play, we get better arousal during play, and you can redefine that any way you want. But we really have sucked the joy out of so many of these things. And, this is my fifth year of traveling with this team and being their sort of performance lead. And I want to tell you an anecdote that, 2 years ago, I noticed that, our women were on the bench and winds are blowing and they're cold. So I brought in this technology that was sort of revolutionary, where coaches are coming down, players are approaching me, refs are like, "What is this?" And I'm like, "These are blankets." And when our women came out, I got these Yeti blankets. Yeti's a partner of ours, and they're these really heavy, windproof, water-resistant blankets. And when the winds were nuking, I would just wrap a blanket around, one of our athletes, and it changed her posture, changed her engagement. She wasn't cold. You can't shiver and go fight. You just can't. If you are shivering and in a threat where your brain is trying to keep you alive, you're not going to be a very good fighter or a very good competitor. So that level of thinking, where I'm like, hey, here's a problem. What is the simple solution? Last year, I started boiling pool water and I made these warm, like your grandma's water bottle, right? That red kind of thermos water bottle thing. I boil pool water and I have like 10 of those so that I can keep our athletes warm on the side of the pool. And suddenly what we see is better output. And so anything that you're doing here, when you start to look at the problems you're solving, I'm seeing that we are not making good catches, that our athletes are reacting slowly. I want us to always be putting a lens through of, hey, I'm creative enough to solve this problem. What does this person need in front of me? And it can be as simple as, hey, let's close our eyes. And when I say open, then I want you to catch, or I want you to bounce and have to turn and come back. And suddenly what you realize is that the strobes are almost a totemic object that inspire me to think, how do I think about getting the eye drill? If you just put the strobes on and are, catching, that's the least that they can do. And then suddenly you're like, well, I'm working with an elderly adult, and all I'm going to do is, occlude some of their vision while they're standing on one leg. And suddenly that becomes a radical game, like, hey, I need you to hop on one leg. And you'll start to see that, okay, I saw that I had an observable, measurable, repeatable clinical change when I optimize for vision. I wonder if it works in this field. I wonder if it works for this position. I wonder if it works for this player. And what that does is it sets you up to start to see the framework of, oh, I didn't recognize that this thing I took for granted was actually a limitation in this person in front of me. And that's where we take the lessons in high performance and we transmute them into the world writ large. Because when I put the goggles on with my wife and we play ping pong, hilarity ensues, right? And so what you'll start to see is you're like,
I love your
wow, I can start to
dynamics.
think about these problems in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And actually with that, there's questions that are popping into the chat that I want to make sure that we have a
Let's do it.
chance to get to. And so with that, the question is, what does the first 15 minutes look like for someone who isn't an athlete,
Mm.
a desk worker
Yeah,
starting
yeah,
their
yeah, yeah.
day, or a
So
weekend
good.
warrior?
So again, what I would say is that how could we use that time to create some play opportunities? So
Mm,
here's a good example. I teach in our courses, one of the things that we're doing is saying, hey, the average person, me, I'm a middle-aged guy, just wants to be faster on my mountain bike, right? I want to be less gross for my wife. Like I don't have any huge aspirations. I want to go adventure and just not get hurt. I carry a tennis ball everywhere I go, and my wife and I actually carry a frisbee everywhere we go. And when we travel, we always have a frisbee, for example. But that tennis ball means that I can get into a lunge shape. right? Which is a position we're valuing as people. And I can perform some of these isometrics that we know get the brain to say this position is safe. I'm restoring positions that maybe I don't have access to because I'm sitting at my computer. And suddenly sitting, I'm in a lunge shape and I'm throwing that ball against the wall or dribbling under my leg. It's asking me to suddenly take my attention off of this boring ass lunge isometric. And suddenly I'm asking myself to side bend and twist. What we can start to do is start to say, hey, how can I get to know myself in these first 15 minutes? If everyone
Mm.
stopped doing our traditional warm-ups and I just said play spike ball for 5 or 10 minutes, what you would find is that you were laughing, you were having a good time, you were dripping sweat. And here's an example. A lot of the things we do look like play. We were playing another team, and it's kind of cold. I think it's January, and that team was in their full kit. We're in Fresno, and their team is in full blown kit. At the end of their warm up, 100% of our women are down to their sports bras. So we have kids wearing hats and overcoats and mittens, and then we have a team that is down to sports bras, dripping sweat. And what I want to ask you is, which team do you not want to play? You don't want to play the team that's laughing and dripping in sweat. You want to play the team that's cold and is not moving. So
That's right.
as a typical person, what we want to do is say, hey, let's take this first 10 or 15 minutes and let's try a thing we've seen on the internet. Let's throw and catch. Let's bounce medicine balls. One of my favorite warm-ups, everyone, is as an adult, is I'll just take a medicine ball and throw it against the wall in as many different ways as I can for 10 minutes. And it's not reps for time. It's me slamming and rotating and touching shapes and having to move quickly. And if we suddenly said, well, what does a training session look like? Well, I'm gonna have to be explosive. Great. Is there any explosion in your warm up? I'm going to have to touch certain heart rates. Great. Is there any heart rate zone touching in your warm up? I'm going to have to, you can start to see, you're like, okay, my preparation doesn't have any of the components that I need to have in this training session. And, I would rather you come in and get under the bar and, and start moving and playing and jump roping and reacting more than, hey, let's go ahead and do the world's greatest stretch on the ground. Let's, doing some spinning on the bike and scrolling. I think there's a lot of wasted time. But if you start to think, how can I do a little bit more play in this? And what you'll see is, I was at a conference and we were all trained together, and some guys went over and did their like football warm up from college. And my friend and I were just throwing a medicine ball back and forth across a huge football field and like laughing and slamming and being creative. And everyone's like, that looks like a lot more fun. I'm like, it is. And so what I think is, how can you put some more fun in to challenge shapes, challenge positions, challenge essential skills? That's how we can really make it so that our training is less sort of formal. Some of our valid criticisms of modern strength and conditioning that's come out of the movement culture, world. I'm talking about like Ido Portal and some of those places. Last year, I made 25 foam swords for our athletes. And if you want to see a good time, go ahead and just make people fight with a foam sword, and then make them fight left-handed, and then make them fight on their standing on one leg left-handed. And it's that play and creativity and dance and twisting and reaction that makes better, more athletic people. We're going to still have to train the physiology. That's why we're in the gym. But I would suggest that we have gotten to a place where we believe that chasing capacity and physiology makes better athletes. And the Senaptec, the strobes should remind us, again, as a totemic idea, that, hey, I'm actually a person interacting in space. I'm not a person on a bike putting another watt down.
Well said. So well said. And so with that, I'm curious. Actually, somebody from our socials is curious as well. But when you think about, the preparation, the movement preparation, um, does it differ from a 6 a.m. training session to, say, an evening training or a 6 a.m. race, or a 6 p.m.
Yeah.
race?
Well, what's so great about the insight there is asking, what does this person in front of me need in this moment? And that
Mm,
at 6 a.m., it's going to be a lot more gradual. And we are going to focus on being a little slower in the beginning, not as dynamic. We're going to raise core temperature. We're going to touch some isometric positions, right? We're going to then, over the course, it's going to start to be a little bit more like sport at the end, right? But at the beginning, hey, I have people who are asleep, and basically, you know, at our gym, I coached a competitors class, and we'd start at 5:45, and people would roll in at 5:44, and I'd already been there, turned on music, I'm prepped, I have to coach and be there. And I was like, hey, how many of you have been awake for 10 minutes? And like every hand, they've been awake less than 10 minutes. They got to the gym. I was like, we're snatching in 18 minutes. Like, that's what I have planned. Like there's no way your tissues can tolerate what I have planned for you at 6 a.m. And
yeah.
so my dressing them down was like, you'll never show up not ready for my training session. So a lot of what we need to do is say, hey, I need to be moving. And I will tell you what, one of the most elite warm up skills that I have is that I program an 800-meter speed walk. And then on the back half, we start skipping. So we go speed walk. We're not running, we're walking very fast. It's hard to walk fast. And then we start skipping on the way back, and we start bounding, and it starts to look like A skips and B skips. And what
Mm,
we've done is we've taken that 8 to 10 minutes that's going to take to that speed walk, that 800, and we've just slowly started to get the system going, and then looking at the person in front of us. So again, even if you just said, hey, I have 800 meters, I'm going to do that first. I'm going to get, I'm not going to get on a bike. I'm going to be in this. I'm going to walk quickly. I'm going to get my core temperature up and blood flow moving. The other thing then is that if I have a game in the afternoon, I may be really working on just goosing awareness. Like, we are awake, we are fed, we are prepped. What are the essential things that allow me to get to the thing the fastest? And it's going to look a lot like more reaction, more sort of integration, more kind of play and dynamic play towards
mhm.
the evening, because that's what the athlete needs me to be ready to go after a long day versus, hey, I'm cold and I've been asleep in my warm bed for the last, 8 hours.
Right. Right. Makes a lot of sense. And I can see how, I mean, either way, wearing the strobe just ups the experience, right?
Yeah,
So,
and if you're talking about yourself, what I would say is, don't come in right away with the strobe. Get your
mhm,
body prepped to a place where you're like, okay, now I'm going to get a lot of utility. You'll see that very quickly, even if you look at and recognize that your brain is the last thing online. Your physiology, you can treat yourself poorly and still perform. But to get the most out of the brain, even if you're like, hey, I don't have a tennis ball, I would suggest put the strobes on and do your warm-up sets with the strobes. You're going to see that deadlifting, squatting, pressing, any of your movements that you're doing become much more interesting to the brain, novel to the brain when you can't see.
so sad. And with that, there's a question from somebody online now, talking about the difference about pre-event, um, thinking about priming session pre-event versus like a dedicated session. And the question is, how do you modulate the priming session with the strobes on a team to increase performance? So maybe the difference between a priming and a dedicated strobe session. I think you just kind of touched on it, but maybe just to
Yeah.
hone in on some examples.
So one of the things that we want to do is just say that, this tool isn't necessarily to be done for 60 minutes. You know what I mean? Like, what you'll see is that if I put the strobes on you, you're not going to lift as much, you're not going to run as fast, right? So what we want to do is start to recognize, I've had enough. I've
Mm,
started to make mistakes. I've gone up from level 1. Everyone wants to jump to level 10, and my daughter is comfortable at level 6 and 7 catching a ball. I am at level 1 too. We start her on level 1 every single time. And when we start to get to a place where we're seeing that the strobes lack utility, we've stopped progressing. Now we're working, we're doing some dense few minutes at the sort of limits of our abilities, then the strobes can easily come off. And this is like any other great tool where we don't have to think about integrating the tool into everything we do. What we want is regular exposure. And my experience
Yes.
with strobes is that people were like, this is really fun. And then there's one session a week. And I'm like, I would rather have 5 minutes 7 days a week than one session that lasts for 20 or 30 minutes with the strobes. So, what are we trying to do? Again, what's fun about strobes is that it's so easy and fun and techy and everyone gets it. And it's a lot. And like, when we put our strobes on our goggles, other athletes are like, hey, I want to go next. I want to go next. I got next, and turning it into a moment where we're saying, okay, now it's sort of run its utility, then we can do the other thing. And what I would always suggest is let's use it as like accommodating resistance, that oftentimes we're using it as a primer to get a better result with the main course. And so
Mhm.
it can be its main course for people who need that and will exceed their abilities, who are low functioning. But for a high level, you'll see that, hey, we wear the strobes, we have a better session. So if we can think about putting strobes in small doses more frequently, you'll see that you'll get much better results from them. And we build the habit that this is part of our training language versus this is a novel thing that comes in when we remember it.
Well said. And there was actually a question in here that says, where does vision training fit in the 15 minutes before, during, and after physical movement prep?
Yeah, you and I were talking just pre-roll. I think we're going to see that there's a bigger and greater role for vision specific optimization, vision retraining as we spent. Look, I mean, it's what, 8 to 10 hours on a screen every single day. It's even more, maybe it's 12 hours for most of our kids. They're on their phones, they're on laptops, they're on the pads. And so we are seeing that we're not doing a good job of strengthening our ability to converge, of refocusing. We're going to see that there are more and more deficits and opportunities to goose this system. So the key here is that almost everything we do has some kind of vision component. And that may be if we're doing lunge circles, I'm keeping the eye on. A good example is when we do some of our shoulder spin up work, which is kind of the ready state. We have a thing called the shoulder spin up, and we'll do some just rotation. I'll have people keep their eyes fixed as long as they can and turn until their eyes get pulled off target. And then they've got to come back and see that quickly again. So when you start to layer in the vision training, and again, this smells and feels like Gary Gray and all the people who've been doing this before, you'll see that it's easy to put this into a lot of the work that we're doing. If someone's doing a cable cross, if we get them to turn their head and do a chop with the cable, suddenly you're like, okay, that there's a vision component to all the things that we're thinking about. And again, um, thinking cleverly about not throwing out the baby with the bathwater and adding in a whole nother thing. You already have a movement language. Where can you begin to put some focus in? That doctor I recommended, Bryce Applebaum, came to
Mhm.
a session I was doing, and I just made all of these adults play catch in these fun positions. And he was like, my mind was blown because you figured out how to make adults have to pause, see the deal, track, react, and bring their vision into this training.
Oh, excellent. And so yeah, with the vision training, there are some guidelines, I would say, or some suggestions, but again, still a lot of room for creativity.
Oh yeah.
And and so I find this question really interesting, and I know we're getting close to our time, but I have heard this actually quite often about almost like how much is too much. So the question specifically is, how often do you use strobes in season, especially when it is intense and the nervous system is fried already?
Mm. Well, what I'll say is I don't think it's so rigorous a stressor. I think it's a novel, fun play stressor. So I have my own experience has been that it's not detrimental. What we see is that we don't need necessarily as much of a dose of it, but we integrate it more and lean into it more in the competitive season because we're seeing down regulation and so many other things. So it's almost like, think caffeine boost for your brain, right? Like, yes, you can absolutely abuse the caffeine, but when we are needing to have athletes appropriately turned up and ready to go amongst the chaos and stress of the season, putting in the strobes as a part of our movement preparation skill and drill feels like not another thing, not another drain. And what I'll tell you is that the athletes will report they've done enough. You'll suddenly see that the goggles are off, and guess what? The athlete is telling you that they've had enough of this drill. And so you'll see that our experience is that if you're paying attention, your athletes will say they're done with this or they've had enough of this. And it may be 3 minutes, it may be 6 minutes, but there will be a time where they're like, okay, I'm ready to go. And the goggles will come off. So I don't have to worry about that as much. I would say that this is one of those questions that's earnest and correct, but I will tell you that your athletes are underfueled, they're underslept, right? Like, they didn't drink, they've had too many, monster energy drinks, and these are the real problems. We're seeing that a lot of
Yes.
our kids in college are, addicted to Zins. They're using 30 milligrams of Zin several times a day. The nicotine, the caffeine. One of the athletes of a softball team I was working with, she was like, well, how many Bang energies is too many in a day? And I was like, one is too many. And she was like, so three, I can't have three a day. And I was like, well, you can, but I wouldn't recommend it. And so if we're talking about all of the CNS design fatigue, what I'll tell you is that, a few extra minutes of strobes is not the reason that my athletes are fatigued.
Said. Well said. And I have fallen to victim of overtraining. And
Sure,
like
that's
just
that's a feature, not a bug.
yeah. I think I'm wiser. I like to think in my older age. But we'll see as I start training again. We'll see what happens. But I what I have found, at least personally for myself, is I know I'm ready to take off the strobes. Is I do a lot of jump roping, skipping with the strobes. I love jump roping with the strobes on as a great warm up. Lunges of all sorts. When also for strength training, so I do a heavy barbell set. With strobes on. When I start to see my form being compromised, I like to push it a little bit, but then when I start to see I'm getting fatigued, then that's kind of my cue. Okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to take these off because it does make it harder.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah,
and
absolutely.
so yeah, so I do like to push the boundaries maybe a little bit, and then I go ahead and take them off.
And a good example is if I'm, prepping one of my athletes in the goalie, and my daughter's a goalie, so I'm very trained to goaliness, and she's a goalie, Division One goalie. Um, if I throw the ball at her at regular play speed, she can't keep up with the strobes. And so suddenly, what you've realized is that, hey, I primed, but we're not at game speed. If I'm going to be at game speed,
Yes.
there's no way I can be at game speed. So the strobes have to come off intuitively, intrinsically. So the other thing that I'd recommend for everyone who's listening is absolutely become a user, and you'll really start to have some insight into what's appropriate and what's not appropriate just based on your experience. Oh, okay, I understand. At some point, this doesn't work as well for me, or I've had a therapeutic dose and
Hmm.
it is subjective. But I'll
Hmm.
tell you that your athletes will tell you goggles come off and I'm ready to go.
Yes.
Trust that brain. But this
Yes.
is this is so untapped space, and when we start, really making sure that our athletes can track in a game situation through our movement prep, through play, we are much better able to solve a lot of sensory motor problems. We just have to layer that into the things we're already doing. And I think that's really reasonable.
Yes, well said. And Kelly, I know we're at our time. I could talk to you for a lot
It's so
longer,
fun. It's so
as
fun.
you know. And so thank you for all the insights and sharing of your knowledge and your experiences. I don't know anybody who's had the experiences like you. So thank you for sharing. And we're excited to share this with people all over the world. And I can't thank you enough, Kelly. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And everyone, if you ever need resources, you can just reach out to info@thereadystate.com and we'll try to point you in the right direction. We really appreciate. And again, just to reiterate, thank you so much. Synaptech has just been such a fun tool to add in that really has improved the performance and play of the athletes we work with. And I love being in a room full of smart coaches.
Yeah, likewise. Well, we'll have this on our socials. We'll be sharing it to everybody. Also, just heads up, we have our next spotlight scheduled for next month with one of our founders and former Navy SEAL, Pete Naschak, and we'll be talking about vision under pressure. So, from combat readiness to sport and just everyday performance. So, keep watch for that on our socials as well as for this recording. We'll make sure that it's out there to be shared. Kelly, you're the best. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.